If you have ever heard of Skinwalkers, you know some of the terrifying stories that come with the name. You also know that there is one rule you should follow. You shouldn't talk about them or it could attract them. I unfortunately didn't listen to that rule. Being that I moved from southern Utah to East Tennessee, I thought I was safe since they originate from the Navajo tribes located there. I could be wrong, but that is what I believed. If you don't know much history about Skinwalkers, I highly recommend researching them on your own due to the fact I don't know how much longer I will survive. I live in a pretty rural part of East Tennessee. There are maybe 200 people in a 30-mile radius of me, which means there aren't many indigenous people around either. Where I live is mildly wooded on the property, and the properties next to me are the same, but towards the back, where the property line ends, it's very densely wooded. I don't know if the property owners before me weeded it out that way, but it seems that way. I live alone with an American Bulldog mix named Maxine. What makes everything even better is I live in a fifth wheel, so you can guess it's small. The slightest wind makes the whole camper rock like a boat. The slightest move makes the camper rock too. My camper has modifications to it, like a deadbolt implemented into the door. It is kinda set up like a studio apartment, just mini. I have a couch and a full-size bed and a kitchen. It's all small but very cozy, just enough room for me and Max to live together comfortably. My camper is insulated well, so you can't hear anything except loud sounds around you. On the given chance a car passes the property I'm on, you won't hear it. But when the rooster crows in the property just next to me, I can hear it. The crow will just be muffled. Another thing to mention is, I work from my camper and don't go many places except my parents or friends if I'm up to driving an hour to see them. Max is my protector. She is friendly until I give her a hand signal, then she will start to snarl and sit in between my legs. I haven't really seen her act protective or even heard her snarl at anything without my signal until now. Even when a wild fox or skunk comes meandering across my property, she hasn't acted protective. The only way I can explain it is she will escort them off the property. She will stay her distance, but she does in a way escort them off. It's cute in a way. She isn't mean to them, doesn't bark at the wild little creatures, won't lunge or chase them. It's almost like she is protecting them. After 3 years of living here, Max won't venture into the densely wooded area of the forest. She doesn't act scared, but she won't go past the property line unless she is on a leash or in the car. After 3 years of living here, you get accustomed to the wildlife and the sounds they make at night. I would say I'm pretty confident with how well I know the area. Well, that was until now. Around a month ago, in August, I was throwing a bonfire for a friend who was going to leave for work-related things, and I don't exactly know how we got into the topic, but we started to talk about spooky, scary things. A friend of mine asked me if I had any spooky folklore to tell, since my friends knew that I lived in southern Utah, and was most likely wanting me to go into mythical creatures and what I knew and if I had any stories. I myself have a very open mind about literally everything. I believe in ghosts and witchcraft, but most of all, if an indigenous person tells me shit, I'm gonna believe them, whether or not it's true. Well, I gave in and started to tell them about Skinwalkers and then Skinwalker Ranch and how freaky it was, that you can't access it anymore because the military won't let you go near it for some reason or another. I mostly touched on spooky things about Skinwalkers, how they are shapeshifters, and how one stalked my grandmother. I went into the nitty-gritty. I talked about how they can lure you into the woods or desert, and how my grandmother's first herd of cattle were ripped apart and thrown around like chew toys. I talked about the screams and how they are blood-curdling and like nothing you have heard before. I detailed about how they can shapeshift from one animal to another and how that animal will sometimes stand up on 2 paws and walk like a human. I also detailed how they are evil, and I made sure to put emphasis on it. All of what I was talking about had my friends in a trance. We were sat around the fire in a circle drinking beer, and when I spoke my stories, they all stopped drinking and focused on what I was saying. It was awesome for me because I'm usually the back burner friend. No one really asks what goes on with my life except horny guys on Tinder looking for a lay or my parents. The night went on and one by one my friends went home. Slowly it became only me and one of my close friends. She leaned in to ask me if everything I said was true, and I did tell her I believed in it, but it's an old tale from my grandmother and Navajo tribes. After another hour of us shitting the bull, she left. and Maxine and I went to bed. Everything was normal after that for about 3 days, then the weird shit started happening. The morning of the 3rd day after the bonfire, I was taking Max for our normal morning walk when we started approaching the end of the property line. Max started snarling and the hair on her back raised, and she started barking at the tree line. It set me off guard, and I tried giving the signal to Max because I thought it was some drugged up person walking in the forest. I couldn't get Maxine's attention. I called her by her nickname, then her full name, but nothing was working. She stood her ground barking and snarling at the tree line. That's when I heard a twig snap in the wood line and Max ran as fast as she could back to our little camper. Like the sane person I am, I didn't investigate. I ran like hell. I didn't want to die. Once we both got inside, Max seemed restless and paced the camper until I made her lay down and rest a bit. Maybe she was having an off day. After her nap, she seemed back to normal, and nothing else seemed to happen during the day. I had forgotten about the stories I told around the fire 3 days beforehand, so I wrote it off as maybe a bear or wild cat. And it made sense because she hasn't seen one before, but it was still weird of her to act how she did. As the day grew older and the sun was ready to set, I let Max out to go and do her business before I started getting ready to settle into my comfy bed and read. Max came back and laid down on her couch and we got settled. I must have fallen asleep reading because I woke up to my book laying on my chest and a blood-curdling scream. Max was up on her couch on all fours staring dead at the door to the camper, growling and snarling. I quickly got up and locked the camper door. I guess I forgot to before I fell asleep, and lifted up my bed to grab a .22 pistol I kept underneath just in case. I called Max to sleep on the bed with me. I'm not going to lie, I was scared. No, not scared, petrified. Max was alert next to me as the screams went on through the night. The screams finally stopped around 4 in the morning and I fell asleep clutching the gun in my right hand and my left hand on Max. I slept until the late morning. I woke up around 11 with Max seemed to have fallen asleep half laying on me facing the front of the camper. I woke Max up to take her to go to the bathroom and to walk around and play a little, and it was like she was back to normal completely. But today we didn't go back to the property line. We stayed closer to the camper and worked and played and listened to nature's music. The day went by normal. At night it was back with the screaming. This went on for a couple weeks and me and Max got used to it, still wary, but used to the screams, until one night came along where things got even more terrifying. It was about 2.5 weeks after the scary screams started. When they started, the screams weren't close by us. They were by the property line in the back, you know, by the dense woods. Well, they seemed to be getting closer this night. Probably more towards the middle of the back property, and there were 2 creatures letting out these horrific screams. By this point I still haven't remembered the skinwalker stories I told the night of the bonfire. Anyways, I was still terrified. But again, I got used to the screams and fell asleep with Max by my side. When me and Max got up the next morning, we went outside and it looked as if a tornado went through. My picnic table was flipped over, the fire pit had been thrown 50 feet to the right, and dead animals ripped and tore to pieces were left absolutely everywhere. And that's when it hit me, you aren't supposed to speak of skinwalkers or it could attract them. But I was in East Tennessee, not Utah or the surrounding states, so how could it be a skinwalker? Me and Max took the 20-minute walk to my nearest neighbor, who I rarely talked to. I had Max on a leash, and as we were coming up onto the small cabin the lady lived in, I noticed dead animals all over her yard too. I knocked on the door and she warily opened it with gun in hand. Now, this lady isn't violent or mean in any way. She is actually rather nice. As she opened the door, she saw it was me through the screen door also in place and set her gun down. Hey, Max and I just came over to see how you were doing. Oh hey Sarah, I'm doing okay. She had trailed off. So, weird shit has been happening on my property and I was just wondering if you have heard screams or anything else at night. I noticed that you have wild animal carcasses littered all over your yard. Yeah. In fact, my dogs went missing a couple days ago and she was cut off by something slamming down next to the house. Her house had trees surrounding her house and littered across her property mildly like mine until you hit the property line. Her property was about 2 acres wider than mine on each side, but the densely wooded forest started where mine had started. She grabbed the gun from arm's length of her and ran past me to the side of the house. I followed her and Max. She went in front of me with her hair up but not barking or snarling. When I reached my neighbor, she was crouched down and sobbing. Max and I walked closer and it came into view that 2 dogs have hit the ground from above. I won't go into detail about them, but it was gruesome. Something had dropped them from the trees, which is weird because skinwalkers don't normally come out during the day, or so I thought. My neighbor quickly stopped crying and ushered us to her truck. She clearly didn't want my company anymore, but I don't blame her. She was going to drive us back home. It took maybe 3 minutes to get from her place to mine. She dropped Max and I off. I thanked her, shut the door, and my neighbor quickly sped off. It was safe to say me and Max spent the rest of the day inside with the door deadbolted. I heard interesting sounds from outside, but I didn't dare to investigate. That night, for the first time in a while, was quiet, and for a brief moment, I thought I was safe, that life could go back to normal. The next 2 nights led me to where I'm at now, telling this story in hopes that someone can tell me what to do. On the first night after the normal night, shit went haywire. Me and Max had fallen asleep around 9 p.m. after a fairly normal day of cleaning my property and getting it back to normal. We were woken by a god-awful scream and twice as bad stench that seemed to be right outside my camper. I knew I had the door deadbolted shut, so I wasn't worried until my camper started shaking, like someone was trying to tip it over. This went on for what seemed like forever until I heard 2 gunshots from the left. Whatever this thing was got hit and screamed a scream I have never in my life heard before. That's when the laughing started. Whatever this thing was started laughing. Like I said before, I don't know much about skinwalkers, so I didn't know they could laugh. The laughing started to go further away in the direction of where the gun went off, and then the rest of the night was quiet. Too quiet. The silence was so deafening, it freaked me out even more. The night crept on and still I didn't hear anything. I started drifting off into sleep when I started to hear banging on my camper door. The banging shook the entire camper, then I heard screaming. "Help me, please let me in. They're coming. Please Sarah, hurry, let me in." The voice seemed to be my neighbor but off. I couldn't explain it. On one hand, it sounded like her, but on the other, it had a slightly off dialect as hers. She had a deep twang to her voice since she grew up in East Tennessee her whole life. But this voice almost like it was trying to mimic her voice. The stench came wafting in through the AC vents just in time, right as I was about to unlock and open the door. I stood frozen in my tracks. The voice then warped to be my father's voice, pleading for help, but I knew I couldn't open that door or it would mean certain death. Then came the other voice, my mother, from the second creature, but again like my neighbor the dialect was slightly off, but they were crying for help. Underneath my full-size bed was a huge storage compartment. It was accessible by a sliding door by the base of the bed. I had it built from metal to fit in the camper, also to use it as a bed frame, but I only kept one gun, my pistol underneath, in case I needed to hide in there for some reason. Well, this was just that reason. I slid open the door and climbed inside and called Max to come in with me, then I shut the door. Everything became muffled at that point. The voices switched between my siblings to my parents, to my neighbor, but since I wasn't willing to come out, this seemed to piss these creatures off even more. I hid under the bed and shook until morning, when I heard police knock. I was wary to come out from my metal shelter, but I did and opened the door. "Hello, is this Sarah's house?" One police officer initiated. "Hello, yes, I'm Sarah. Is something wrong? We just wanted to ask some questions about you, neighbor. Did you witness any grizzly bear or wild cats on your property lately? Maybe even a person?" "Well, not a bear or wild cat, but some weird stuff has been going on around here lately," and I told the officers about everything that had happened in the past month, up until that point. Of course I knew nothing was going to come of it, because the police force don't go looking into mythical creatures, but they did take my statement and left. But before they did, I told them if they needed to get in contact with me to go to my parents' address. That's when they told me it was a good idea to leave because my neighbor had been brutally murdered and ripped apart by something or someone. It was her who shot at the creatures. At that point I was done. I was ready to pack up and leave. So I started to pack everything up, and I called my parents to let them know I was moving onto their property. My dad asked if I needed help and I obliged, and he said he would be there within the hour to help me load up my camper onto my truck, which I have only done a handful of times. Then I called my place of employment and apologized for the late reports and let them know I would get back to work tomorrow, that I was having some trouble with getting them uploaded. I was only halfway through packing my shit when my dad arrived. He didn't ask any questions but did in fact help me pack and secure the inside of my camper down so when traveling my stuff wouldn't fly all over the place. He noticed that all of my outdoor items had been completely trashed and pushed them to the side and out of the way, which I thanked him for since there was no way in hell I was taking them with me, especially after what I heard from the police. We finally finished packing and hooking up my fifth wheel camper to my truck in the late afternoon around 5 p.m. I loaded up Max and my dad led the way. I finally felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. Finally, I felt like I was safe. Maybe whatever is there will stay there. My dad didn't ask me what was wrong, he just knew. And like any good father, he helped me get packed and ready to move back home. Even though I was still going to live in my fifth wheel with Max, I felt safe. As I was driving, I felt happy again, not so terrified of whatever was going on behind me. I was singing and dancing and giving Max all the love and appraisal she deserved for helping me get through it all. As all this happiness appeared, I quickly went. I looked over into the woods and two creatures were running alongside my truck in the wood line. The way back to my parents' house was through back roads in the county, which means they were long, curvy, heavily wooded, and more than one creek winding through them. Most of the creeks didn't have guardrails since the roads weren't used as much as they would be in a city or town. The roads were easy to navigate in the day, but since the sun was setting quickly, I knew we had to get to the house as quickly as possible. I tried everything to distract myself from the creatures running beside my truck. I looked over at Max and she was sound asleep, not even noticing them. Somehow, I couldn't keep my eyes off of them. I tried as hard as I could to focus on the road and my surroundings. I tried to focus on how pretty the leaves looked during the fall. I thought of my family and friends. I thought of all my wonderful coworkers who did on occasion call or send me flowers for being good at my job. I looked at all the streams and creeks I was passing and admiring how beautiful they looked. I listened to the radio playing all my favorite oldies and sang along to them. Still, my eyes drifted. They weren't slowing down. They didn't seem tired. These creatures were still weaving in and out of the tree line, staring me down. I couldn't quite look at them long enough to figure out what they were, but they were some sort of dog-like creature. Yet, as I was driving, they seemed to be silent. They didn't scream or do weird noises like I heard the night before. They almost seemed to be waiting for something. The sun was setting even faster. It was slowly getting darker and darker. Luckily, I had amazing headlights to light up the road in front of my pretty well. But still, the part of the county we were in had a two-lane road that was small. Only one yellow line distinguished which side of the road you were on. Since I had a heavy-duty truck, I had to ride in the middle so I wouldn't send my truck nor my camper into the ditch. I continued to drive behind my dad, occasionally looking to see how far ahead he was. He didn't travel faster than the speed limit, but this time he was 30 yards ahead of me. I sped up to keep close behind. I was slowly catching up when we passed over one of the deeper creeks. Bam, splash, something had hit the side of my truck hard enough to flip it off the road. I must have been unconscious for hours. When I came to, I woke up with someone flashing a light in my eyes. I could see their mouths moving, but all I could hear was a deep ringing. Everything seemed fuzzy, and I drifted between conscious and unconsciousness. The last thing I remember was getting loaded onto the ambulance and seeing my truck and camper in literary pieces. I couldn't see the Max at first, but when I did, I noticed she was 10 feet up into a tree and shredded to pieces. I don't remember much, but I do remember I had been transported to a hospital near a decent-sized city, and I had been in a coma for only a couple days when I finally woke up. I woke up in the middle of the night when a nurse came to check on me. When she opened the door and saw I was awake, she ran out in a panic. It must have been a good 10 minutes when she and a man came walking in. "Hey, you're going to be fine. I see you have woken up. Do you know where you are?" the man said. I couldn't talk. I had a fucking piece of plastic shoved down my throat. When I noticed it, I started gagging and coughing. The nurse quickly grabbed something and shoved it into my IV, and I was out like a light again. From what my parents told me, I had to be put into a coma for 3 weeks to let my body heal from the accident. I eventually woke up, healed and ready to get up and go, but alas, I still had to stay for a week to let my body adjust. I don't really know. Eventually, I did get to go home to my parents. I had no truck, I had no camp trailer, and I had no Max. I still remember the shape her body was in, and I don't think anyone but me noticed. I spent most of my first day home mourning the loss of Max. I missed her so much. She didn't deserve this. I felt like all of this was my fault. and essentially it was. That night the noises started back up, the screams, the different voices, everything. I was pissed. What could they possibly want? They killed my dog, ruined my truck and camper, and put me in a coma for weeks on end. I got up and wobbled outside. Shut up, go away. I screamed everything I possibly could to get them to go away. I walked out further into my parents' yard to confront these senile creatures. That's when I noticed they didn't look like dogs or coyotes or wolves. They kind of did, but not fully. The back end of them was the body of a dog, but the front was humanism, and the head of the creature was big, fluffy, and misshapen. There were at least 20 of these creatures. I quickly turned on my heel and went back inside. I could tell they were running right for me, but I couldn't run. I was still hurt. I accepted the fact that I could possibly get killed, and I was fine with it. I wasn't with anyone, and my parents have multiple children. I reached the door, quickly ran and shut it, and locked it all in time. I could hear the creatures throw their bodies against the house, and it felt like a never-ending earthquake shook the house to its core. I could feel them breathe. My parents came running down the stairs and grabbed me, rushing me down to the basement as the back door splintered into pieces, letting more of the evil creatures in. My dad deadbolted and hit a little red button in the basement. The sound of screeching metal filled my ears as a metal box surrounded the room. "Why haven't you ever told me of this?" I asked. "I built it just in case," my dad replied. And with that reply, he went cold. That's when I knew this has happened before, to Grandma, and as far as I know to me. I turned to my mother and I asked her, "What happened?" She looked at me and sighed. She knew exactly what I meant when I asked her question, which sent her into a story I have never even imagined. Back in the day, when Grandma was a young teenager, her parents lived here in Tennessee. She dated a young Shawnee boy. She loved this boy to pieces. They spent every waking moment attached at the hip. Well, her daddy didn't like him too much. He thought it was unethical, fucking racist bastard, and decided to, well, take care of the problem. Since then, the Shawnee tribe has cursed any land our family has touched. That's why she died when you were young. Different creatures of the day or night stalk us, waiting for the moment to kill us. And you called upon one of the night creatures, and now they're here. I could hear furniture being ripped to pieces, and the house torn apart. My heart pounded out of my chest. I was angry, I was depressed knowing what my mom was going to say next. They are here because you called them upon us again. We lived in the shadows. Until now. She stopped and turned away. I could tell that she was angry and frustrated. I felt my heart sink to my stomach. I did this. This was all my fault. It had felt like we had been in this metal imprisonment for weeks. We had enough food and only one single flashlight. We had buckets with lids for hours. You know the business. We slept on the floor in sleeping bags, and for pillows, we used our jackets. It was coyish, a little too cozy. My parents didn't really talk to me, nor I to them. I was subsequently the one who brought this upon us, with the help of my grandmother, of course. Throughout this entirety, we still heard the creatures scream. They had stopped ripping apart our house after a few hours. Unfortunately, they did surround the metal box, or that's what it seemed like. They were waiting for us to come out of hiding. They would quiet down for a couple of hours, then they would scream and try to lure us out of our metal bunker, using the voices of people in our lives. One by one, they cycled through people, from my mother's patients to friends and family members, until all we heard was what seemed like a crowd of people screaming and bawling their eyes out. They did this every single time. It was wearing my mom out. At one point, me and Dad had to physically sit on her to get her from pushing the button. Hell, let's be honest, it was wearing us out. They knew how to trigger our emotions. Only a handful of times did I hear Max's disembodied yelp and screams. It infuriated me. My poor baby didn't deserve this bullshit. Every time I heard that yelp, I wanted to push the button and run out to save her, but right before I did, I remembered each time that she was gone. I was going insane. I felt like shit for putting Max into the situation that leads her to her demise. I felt like I had put my family in a death or death situation. My parents wouldn't talk to me if at all, and I was defeated. One what I believed to be a day, everything was going about as our new normal when I started hearing whimpering. A couple of the creatures started to whimper for a while, then struck absolute chaos. Sirens and gunshots and what sounded like chanting rang through the metal bunker. It was a bittersweet feeling to hear something other than creatures trying to kill us. At one end, was it just our minds playing tricks on us, or was it real? My parents heard it too. They actually started talking to me and to each other. Then we made up a game plan. When the gunshots and sirens stop and we hear voices, we will hit the button and take the risk of going back into the house. If we die, whatever. If we live, awesome, let's move on with our lives. And we took our places around the bunker and waited. It seemed like hours had passed before the gunshots and sirens stopped ringing. That's when we heard two voices calling out our names. Hesitantly, my dad hit the button and slowly the mental prison we had been confined to lifted. I could hear the slabs of metal slamming back to their dormant position and light filling up the room like a pleasant ocean. I was the first to walk up and out of the bunker. I walked up the stairs. That's when I saw her. I remembered at that moment, if for any reason that someone couldn't contact me or my parents, they were to call my closest friend Sierra. She was my 3 and final emergency contact on all my forms. Next to her was the cop on the scene at my accident. I walked up with my hands in the air so I wouldn't get shot and killed by the policeman, and my parents followed behind closely. I hugged Sierra before I could notice my parents' house. It was an absolute shambles. A whole wall had been torn off and ripped to pieces. All of the furniture had been turned literally inside out. Holes in the wall, the whole 9 yards. People who I didn't recognize walked around the house chanting something, and the police officer started to speak. I don't remember much of the conversation, but I do remember that the hospital called Sierra to notify her that I hadn't made it to one of my appointments and couldn't get a hold of me. She had informed them that she hadn't been able to get a hold of me either, and then she contacted the authorities. She had driven past my parents' property before the authorities had arrived and smelled a stench that was all too recognizable, and called a friend who was a part of the Shawnee tribe. Then had called the authorities to tell them to meet her somewhere close by to explain the situation she had just seen and to give her and them time for the Shawnee tribe to arrive. From there, that's when they saved us. The officer looked at my parents and started to explain that unfortunately with situations like these, we had to go into a protection plan, kind of like the witness protection plan but different. The indigenous groups of America came up with a protection plan for people who had things like this happen, which meant me and my parents and Sierra had to uproot our lives and move somewhere completely different, change our names and social security numbers, and become completely different people. I looked towards my parents and they looked so undeniably defeated but eventually agreed. The officer turned to me and Sierra and asked if I wanted to do the same or risk having my life be taken. I and Sierra agreed. Before I could be whisked into a new life, I asked to go outside and get a breath of fresh air. The officer agreed and I walked out the back door. This time there weren't any weird creatures smiling back at me viciously. I sat down on the grass in my backyard and looked up to the sky and thanked Max for everything she did for me. I thanked my neighbor and her dogs and all the animals who died in this process, and I apologized to all of them. Then I sat in pure silence, embracing every twitter from the birds, every day of sunlight that grazed my skin, and breathed from not far but distant enough. I heard a tiny whimper. I got up, and despite my mind telling me how stupid can you fucking be, you almost died just now, stopped walking towards it. I let my body walk towards the bush that it was coming from. I reached underneath to see what it was and to pull it out, when I felt something fluffy. Not really surprised, I pulled out the fluffy little creatures from under the bush, and I looked at it and smiled. A small dark fox with markings around its ears and eyes like Max's looked up at me. It was malnourished and needed somewhere warm to be, so I took it and walked inside. The cop looked at me and the foxling and ushered us to his vehicle without question. Here I am, on this car ride to the station. All I can hope for is peace and protection. I am going to look after and raise this foxling as best I can until it's time to be released into the wild. Wish me luck. Thank you to my superfans, Sweet Black Swan, Tacey, and Brooklyn. I really appreciate you guys supporting my channel, and I look forward to making more content for everyone.